Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's episode is a patron-selected deck tech. Once a month, patrons of this show vote on what commander they'd like to see on an upcoming episode. And this month, the patrons actually got a second commander. And the commander that received the second most votes was Pir and Toothy. Pir and Toothy are partner commanders, so we can use them together as our commander. Pir Imaginative Rascal is a 1/1 human that costs 2 and a green. It says if one or more counters will be put on a permanent your team controls, that many plus one of each of those kinds of counters are put on that permanent instead. And Toothy Imaginary Friend is a 1/1 illusion that costs 3 and a blue. It says whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Toothy Imaginary Friend. And when Toothy leaves the battlefield, draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. So essentially when we have both of these in play, whenever we draw a card, Toothy is going to get 2 +1/+1 counters. On top of that, when he does leave play, we're going to get to draw a ton of cards. There are plenty of ways that we can abuse this and make Toothy huge quickly. So we're going to build around both of these commanders with a Voltron style deck. Our strategy for this deck is to get both of our commanders out quickly and start drawing a ton of cards. By drawing a ton of cards with both of our commanders in play, Toothy is going to get huge quickly. And then how we win with this deck is pretty simple. We're going to make Toothy unblockable and swing through for lethal. Kills with this deck can come out of nowhere. Toothy may just start off as a 1/1, but we can easily get 20 or more counters on him quickly. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's start off with tactic number 1, 2 or less. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put in play tapped. Then we're going to be running Search for Tomorrow, which is another great turn 1 play. It has to spend 2 for a green, and we can search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield. Next up, we've got Broken Bond, which says destroy target artifact or enchantment. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. And then there's Explore, which lets us play an additional land, and we get to draw a card. Next, there's Growth Spiral, which is essentially the same thing but at instant speed. Explore and Growth Spiral are especially good in this deck because they draw us cards. Again, if we have both of our commanders in play, that's an extra 2 counters on Toothy. And then we're going to be running Rampant Growth, which lets us search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Edge of Autumn does the exact same thing, but only if we control 4 or fewer lands. But we can also cycle it by sacrificing a land. Essentially, this is a free way to get counters on Toothy later in the game. And finally, we're going to be running 3 mana rocks with Mind Stone, Sphere of the Suns, and Simic Signet. Mind Stone can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card. Sphere of the Suns enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for either of our colors 3 times. And we can pay 1 to tap Simic Signet to add both of our colors to our mana pool. You may have noticed that each and every single one of these ramp spells essentially costs 2 or less. The goal for this deck is to get our commanders out as quickly as possible. Generally, the best line of play for this deck is to ramp on turn 2 so we can cast Toothy on turn 3. So on turn 4, we can cast Pir and another spell. As soon as our commanders hit the battlefield, we want to start drawing cards as quickly as possible. So let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 2, draw up a plan. First up, there's Frantic Search, which says draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, untap up to 3 lands. Not only does this card help us loot, but essentially it's a free way for us to get counters on Toothy. And then we're going to be running Tezzeret's Gambit, which says draw 2 cards, then proliferate. Essentially with Pir and Toothy in play, this is going to get Toothy 6 counters for the price of 3 mana and 2 life. But next up, we've got some even more efficient cards with Brainstorm, Ideas Unbound, and Treasure Cruise. Brainstorm says draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. Ideas Unbound says draw 3 cards, discard 3 cards at end of turn. And Treasure Cruise costs 8, but it has Delve and it says draw 3 cards. With the amount of cards that we're going to be drawing and discarding in this deck, Treasure Cruise is pretty much always just going to cost 1 mana. Next up, we've got Careful Consideration, which is a pretty flexible draw spell. It's going to let us draw 4 cards and then discard 3 cards, but if we cast it during our main phase, we just have to discard 2 cards instead. There are times when we can afford to cast this during our main phase, but there are also times that we want to cast this right before our turn. That instant speed flexibility can really help us out in a lot of situations. And then we've got some cards that can draw us a ton of cards depending on the situation. First, there's Hunter's Insight, which says choose target creature you control. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker this turn, draw that many cards. So let's say Toothy has 5 power and gets through and hits an opponent when we cast Hunter's Insight. We're going to be drawing 5 cards, and with both of our commanders in play, Toothy's going to get 10 counters. This is an incredible value for only 3 mana, but again, it is dependent on us actually hitting with Toothy. And then there's Give and Take, which is a fuse card so we can cast either one or both. Give says put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature. And Take says remove all +1/+1 counters from target creature you control, draw that many cards. Most of the times we're going to have far better things to do than cast Give, but Take is an absolutely incredible effect for this deck. Say that we have both of our commanders in play, and Toothy already has 4 +1/+1 counters on it. When we cast Take, we're going to remove those counters, draw 4 cards, and Toothy's going to get 8 counters instead. Not only can this card draw us a ton of cards, but it can also essentially double the number of counters on Toothy. And finally, we've got Read the Runes and Pull from Tomorrow, both of which are going to draw us X cards at instant speed. But for each card drawn with Read the Runes, we're going to have to discard a card unless we sacrifice a permanent. And Pull from Tomorrow does cost us 1 more, but it only makes us discard 1 card. Both of these cards are great mana sinks either right before our turn or even during combat. If Toothy gets through, we can easily pump up its power by drawing a ton of cards at once with either one of these. But we've got more mana efficient ways that we can draw a lot of cards at once. So let's go through some of those ways in tactic number 3, Wheel and Deal. First up, there's Credit Voucher, which we can pay 2 to sacrifice it and shuffle any number of cards from our hand into our library, then draw that many cards. Flux is very similar, but it's going to let every single player do that, and we get to draw a card. Both of these are really efficient ways to draw a ton of cards at once for not a lot of mana investment. With both of our commanders in play, wheel cards can make Toothy into a monster quickly. So we're also going to be running Laquatus's Creativity. It's going to let us draw cards equal to the number of cards in our hand and then discard that many cards. So this is actually kind of the reverse process of the last 2 cards and lets us be more selective on what we keep. Because of that though, it does have a higher mana cost at 5. Next up is Tolarian Winds, which says discard your hand, then draw that many cards. At instant speed and only for 2 mana, this is a fantastic card in this deck. And then when Whirlpool Rider comes into play, we get to shuffle the cards from our hand into our library, then draw that many cards. Whirlpool Drake does the exact same thing, but we get the exact same effect when it dies too. These are very cheap and efficient ways to draw a ton of cards at once. Next up, we're going to be running Forgotten Creation, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may discard all the cards in your hand if you do draw that many cards. If this sticks around, it's going to get a ton of counters on Toothy throughout the game. And then there's Windfall, which says each player discards their hand, then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. So if one of our opponents happens to have more cards in their hand, this is just going to benefit us more. And finally, we've got 2 cards that are each going to draw 7 cards every single time with Diminishing Returns and Game Plan. Diminishing Returns says each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, you exile the top 10 cards of your library, then each player draws up to 7 cards. So for only 4 mana, this essentially gets 14 counters on Toothy. And then there's Game Plan, which has assist, and it says each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards, exile Game Plan. Although Game Plan does have assist, generally players aren't going to want us to draw cards with our deck. This is still a good card for the deck, but just don't expect any help casting it. Now these wheels are very powerful, but some of the most effective draw spells in this deck aren't actually draw spells at all. Let's go through them now in tactic number 4, Never Left. First up, there's Essence Flux and Siren's Ruse, both of which are going to exile target creature we control and then return to the battlefield under its owner's control. So let's say we've got both of our commanders in play and 4+1/+1 counters on Toothy. If we cast Essence Flux, it's going to exile Toothy and bring him right back. Then we get Toothy's Leave the Battlefield trigger, so we're going to draw 4 cards. Since we drew 4 cards, Toothy's going to get 8+1/+1 counters. So for just 1 mana, we drew 4 cards and doubled up Toothy's +1/+1 counters. And this was a very tame example for this deck. There are plenty of times when we have well more than 10 +1/+1 counters on Toothy, so we're going to be drawing a ton of cards and getting even more counters on it. These are also great spells to protect either one of our commanders and save them from targeted removal. So we're going to be running some more similar effects with Ghostly Flicker, Displace, and Illusionist Stratagem. Ghostly Flicker says exile 2 target artifacts, creatures, and/or lands you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under your control. Displace says exile up to 2 target creatures you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. And Illusionist Stratagem does the exact same thing, but it's also going to draw us a card. These blink effects do so much in this deck and are a fantastic addition. But blink effects aren't the only ways that we can protect our commanders. So let's go through some more in tactic number 5, Mouth Guard. First up, there's Mask of Avacyn and Swiftfoot Boots, both of which give one of our creatures hexproof. Mask of Avacyn does give +1/+2, and Swiftfoot Boots also gives haste. This haste is especially effective with Toothy because we can swing right away when he comes down. And then we're running Voyager Staff, which we can pay 2 and sacrifice it to exile target creature and return the exile creature card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Now we can use this to save Toothy, but since it's a flicker effect and not a blink effect, it's not going to help us in the same way. We still get to draw the cards when Toothy leaves the battlefield, but he's not going to see us draw those cards. It's still an effective card though to either save Toothy or to draw us a ton of cards if we need to. And finally there's Rapid Vigor, which is going to regenerate each creature that we control. This is a good instant speed way to save both of our commanders in a dire situation. But we also have some cards that can not only protect Toothy, but can also help get it through. So let's go through those cards now in tactic number 6, Best of Both Worlds. First up, there's Canopy Cover, which is an aura that says enchanted creature can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. It also says that the enchanted creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. So not only does this give Toothy some evasion, but it also helps protect it. And we're also going to be running Whisper Silk Cloak, which says equipped creature can't be blocked and has Shroud. Now in this deck, we much prefer Hexproof to Shroud. Shroud is great at protecting our commander, but it also prevents us from targeting it too. So when this is equipped to Toothy, we can't target it with any of our blink spells. It's still a fantastic card and a great addition to the deck, but just keep that in mind. But these aren't the only ways that we're going to give Toothy evasion, so let's go on to tactic number 7, Perfect Teeth. First up, we've got some ways to make Toothy fly with Nora Coversail, Cobbled Wings, and Fleet Feather Sandals. And Fleet Feather Sandals also gives Toothy haste. This can be a very dangerous piece of equipment for us and can help us kill out of nowhere. Next up is Wonder, which says, as long as Wonder is in your graveyard and you control an island, creatures you control have flying. This deck has plenty of ways for us to discard cards, so it's very easy for us to get Wonder in our graveyard. And then we're running Prowler's Helm, which says, equipped creature can't be blocked except by walls. And luckily for us, the vast majority of decks don't run any walls. And finally, we're going to be running 2 cards that make Toothy unblockable every single time. We can tap Key to the City to discard a card, and up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn, and when it untaps, we can pay 2 to draw a card. And then Herald of Secret Streams has creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them can't be blocked. Both of these are fantastic ways for us to guarantee that Toothy gets through. But we've also got some flexible cards to help Toothy get through too. So let's go through some now in tactic number 8, an apple a day. First up, we've got 3 spells that are going to tap down creatures with Icy Blast, Bluster Squall, and Ensnare. Icy Blast is going to tap down X creatures, and since it has Ferocious, the vast majority of the time, it's going to make sure that those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. And when we overload Bluster Squall, it's going to tap down every single creature that we don't control. Ensnare is going to tap down all creatures, but we can actually return 2 islands back to our hand to cast this spell for free. Now these spells are great at helping us get Toothy through when we need to, but we can also use them defensively if we need to as well. So we're also going to be running some more defensive spells with Aetherize and Illusionist Gambit. Aetherize is going to return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. And basically Illusionist Gambit forces the person that attacked us to take those creatures back and swing at someone else. And finally there's Aether Gale, which is going to return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. This is a fantastic spell that really throws a wrench in our opponent's plans. It can also remove pretty much every single blocker from one person's board. But what are some other ways that we can throw a wrench in our opponent's plans? Let's go through them now in tactic number 9, don't count on it. First up there's Negate, which is going to counter target non-creature spell. And we're also going to be running Unwind, which does the exact same thing, but it also lets us untap up to 3 lands. Next up is Rewind, which is similar, and it's going to counter target spell and untap up to 4 lands. Since we're running plenty of instant speed draw spells, both of these come in huge by giving us some mana back. And finally there's Commit to Memory, and Commit is going to put target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library second from the top. And Memory has Aftermath, so we can cast it from our graveyard. It's going to make each player shuffle their hand into their graveyard and then draw 7 cards. So not only can this deal with a crucial spell or permanent, but it can also draw us a ton of cards. But now let's talk about some really impactful cards that can really help us finish out the game. So we're going to move on to our final tactic, which is tactic number 10, Pearly Whites. First up there's Trade Routes, which allows us to pay 1 to return target land we control back to our hand. And then we can pay 1 to discard a land card to draw a card. With all the draw spells and wheel effects in this deck, we're pretty much always going to have some lands in our hand. With both of our commanders in play, this essentially allows us to pay 1 to discard a land, draw a card, and put 2 +1/+1 counters on Toothy. Not only can this get us some more impactful cards, but it can also pump Toothy very easily. Since we can do this at instant speed, it can also help us get those extra points of power to kill one of our opponents. And although this is a great card for this deck, the Golden Pig is even better. The Golden Pig is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Solidarity of Heroes. It's an instant that costs 1 and a green and it has Strive. So the spell is going to cost 1 and a green more to cast for each target beyond the first. It says choose any number of target creatures, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each of them. Now we're pretty much only going to be casting this targeting Toothy, so it's only going to cost us 2. But this card is an absolute powerhouse in this deck. It allows us to kill our opponents with Toothy out of nowhere. If we can get just 10 +1/+1 counters on Toothy, which is a very easy task for this deck, this card makes it lethal. Our draw spells can be very impactful, but they also somewhat depend on Pir being in play to get an absurd amount of counters on Toothy. Our wheel spells are also very powerful, but they usually depend on how many cards we have in our hand. As long as we have counters on Toothy, this card is always impactful. An opponent might think that they're safe when Toothy's coming through, and this card makes it lethal. In my opinion, it's the deadliest card in this deck, and that's what makes it the Golden Pig. Next up, we've got Brawl the Hulklade, which does pretty much the exact same thing, but on a body. We can pay a green and a blue to tap it to double the number of each kind of counter on target artifact, creature, or land. While this is a repeatable effect, it also takes us 1 turn to actually use it. So unlike Solidarity of Heroes, this can't really come out of nowhere. And then we're running Forgotten Ancient, which says whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. With Pir in play, this can get an absurd number of +1/+1 counters on it because anytime a player casts a spell, it gets 2. And then during our upkeep, we can just move all those counters onto Toothy. Finally, we've got Simic Ascendancy, which is a great alternative win con for this deck. It has pay 1 green blue, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. Getting 20 or more growth counters on this is something that we can easily do in 1 turn. So if our opponents don't find a way to deal with this, we're just going to win the game. This deck is a ton of fun and can kill very quickly. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, we're going to be running Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then there's Warp Landscape, which can tap for a colorless, or can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up is Simic Guildgate, Woodland Stream, and Thornwood Falls, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a green or a blue. On top of that, Thornwood Falls is going to gain us 1 life when it comes into play. And then we're running Vivid Creek and Vivid Grove, both of which enter the battlefield tapped with 2 charge counters on them. Each of them taps for 1 of our colors, or we can tap them to remove a charge counter from them to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Next up is Simic Growth Chamber, which enters the battlefield tapped and is going to make us return a land back to our hand. It does have the upside though of tapping for both of our colors. And then we're running Rogue's Passage, which we can tap for our colors, or we can pay 4 to tap it and target creature can't be blocked this turn. Next up we've got Opal Palace and Forge of Heroes, both of which can get +1/+1 counters on Toothy. And finally we're going to be running 23 basic lands, 16 of those are going to be islands, and 7 will be a forest. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Pir and Toothy EDHREC deck is going to set you back $195.96, let's say we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.90. And just a quick reminder that our deck cost actually doesn't include our commander because it is a commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades that you can add into the deck and what I would take out for those cards too. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into this, these reasonable upgrades are going to be completely based off of my own perspective. When you're making choices on how to adjust your deck, you're taking your own playstyle and meta into account. So make sure that you factor that in when it comes to making your own decisions on what to swap in and what to swap out. Now that we're on the same page, let's go through how I personally would upgrade the deck. First up, we're going to be adding in Hardened Scales, which comes in at $3.62. It's an enchantment that costs a green, and it says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, that many +1 are put on it instead. To put Hardened Scales in, we're going to be taking out Hunter's Insight. Hardened Scales is an absolute bomb in this deck and is pretty much an extra copy of Pir. Hunter's Insight can be a great card, but it's also very dependent on us actually hitting with Toothy. And then let's upgrade the deck by putting in Teferi's Puzzle Box, which comes in at $5.70. It's an artifact that costs 4, and it says at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player puts the cards in his or her hand on the bottom of his or her library in any order, then draws that many cards. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Laquatus' Creativity. After we get it in play, Teferi's Puzzle Box can provide us with a ton of value throughout the game for free. Laquatus' Creativity is a good card, but it's also overcosted for what it does. Next up, we're going to be adding in Jace's Archivist, which comes in at $3.15. It's a 2/2 Vidalcan Wizard that costs 1 blue. It has pay a blue and tap it. Each player discards their hand, then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. To put this card in, we're going to be taking out Varel the Hulklade. This card is a very cheap and efficient way for us to draw a ton of cards throughout the game. At only 1 mana, this ability is cheaper than Varel's as well. Also, since it can actually help other players out, it's less likely to be removed than Varel. And then we're going to be adding in Time Reversal, which comes in at $1.56. It's a sorcery that costs 3 blue, and it says each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library, then draws 7 cards, exile Time Reversal. To put Time Reversal in, we're going to be taking out Game Plan. These cards are essentially identical, but Time Reversal costs us 1 less. Game Plan does have assists, but the vast majority of the time, if not all the time, no one is ever going to help us cast this. With this deck, using mana efficiently is very important for us, so this is an easy swap. Next up, we're going to be adding in Lightning Greaves, which comes in at $7.38. It's an equipment that costs 2 and it costs 0 to equip. And it's going to give the equipped creature Haste and Shroud. To put Lightning Greaves in, we're going to take out Canopy Cover. Lightning Greaves is a fantastic way to protect Toothy and to make him a threat right away. And although Shroud is worse than Hexproof for us, we'll still take it. Canopy Cover is an aura, so it's much worse than equipment. If it's ever attached to Toothy and Toothy dies or we just blink it, we lose Canopy Cover. Whereas Lightning Greaves would stay on the field and we can equip it for free. Finally, we're going to be adding in Heroic Intervention, which comes in at $7.33. It's an instant that costs 1 and a green, and it says permanents you control gain Hexproof and Indestructible until end of turn. To put this in, we're going to take out Wrap and Vigor. Both of these cards cost the exact same amount, and Heroic Intervention is just better in every single way. Pir and Toothy might be fantastic friends, but if you want to go check out one of this show's friends, go check out Tamio's Journal. Tamio's Journal is part of the Creators Quarters initiative, and their very first episode just released. So go check out that episode on Abzan Nights and like and subscribe to their channel. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.